The year was 1879, and the heat that settled over Cinder Creek was a physical weight. It was a suffocating blanket woven from red dust and shimmering air, a presence that warped the horizon and baked the very life out of the land. The wind, when it came, offered no relief. It was a hot, angry breath that scoured the plains, picking up the fine crimson soil and flinging it against the unpainted timber of the town's few buildings. The dust hung in the air like a perpetual haze, a fine powder that coated everything, worked its way into the folds of clothing, and left a gritty film on the teeth. It was the color of old blood, and on days like this, when the wind howled and the sun beat down without mercy, it looked as if the whole world was burning. Luke Harrow felt the grit between his teeth as he guided the last of his herd toward the weathered rails of his corral. His shoulders ached with a deep, familiar burn, the kind that came from long hours in the saddle under a relentless sun. The leather reins felt slick with sweat in his calloused hands. A sudden sharp tug from a spooked mare had snapped a rein back against his shoulder earlier, the lash tearing a clean line through the worn chambray of his shirt. He hadn't flinched. He just grunted, gathered the leather, and kept moving. Pain was just another part of the landscape, as constant as the wind and the dust. The horses were skittish, their coats dark with sweat, their eyes wide and rolling. They smelled the dryness in the air, the promise of a long, thirsty night. They felt the tension that clung to the land, a low hum of struggle that was as real as the cracked earth beneath their hooves. As he neared the edge of town, a narrow crossing over the desiccated wound that was Cinder Creek, he saw the wagon. It was tilted at a dangerous angle. One of its heavy rear wheels sunk deep into the hard-packed clay of the creek bed. The creek itself was a ghost, a network of deep, sun-baked cracks where water should have been. The wagon wheel had found a fissure, a weakness in the earth, and the ground had swallowed it whole, imprisoning it up to the axle. A lone horse stood harnessed to the wagon, its head bowed in exhaustion, its tail flicking half-heartedly at the cloud of persistent flies. A woman stood beside the sunken wheel, her back to him. Her hands were covered in the same red dust that covered everything else. She was digging, trying to scoop away the unyielding earth with her bare fingers, a futile effort that spoke of a quiet desperation. She wore a simple dress of dark calico, practical and sturdy, but the fine layer of dust had muted its color to a uniform reddish-brown. Her bonnet had slipped back, revealing coils of dark hair pinned tightly at the nape of her neck. Those stray tendrils had escaped to cling to her damp skin. Luke pulled his horse to a halt, the rest of the herd milling restlessly behind him. He watched her for a moment, a silent tableau of struggle against an indifferent landscape. He could have ridden on. It wasn't his trouble. Trouble was something he had in abundance, a crop that grew thick and fast on Harrow land. But his father had raised him with a simple code: you don't leave a person stranded if you have two good hands to help. He swung a leg over his saddle, his boots landing with a soft thud in the dust. The sound made the woman startle, and she straightened up, turning to face him. Her name was Eliza Hart, a fact he didn't know and wouldn't have thought to ask. She was a traveling seamstress, her wagon a small, self-contained world of fabric bolts, spools of thread, and the gleaming black iron of her sewing machine. Her face was smudged with dirt, and her eyes, a startling shade of clear gray, were shadowed with fatigue. She looked at him, not with the immediate relief of a person being rescued, but with a cautious, assessing gaze. In a place like Cinder Creek, a strange man appearing out of the dust was not always a cause for celebration. "Looks like you're in a bind," Luke said, his voice a low rasp, dry from the dust. "The ground gave way," she stated, her voice steady despite the strain evident in her posture. "I didn't see the crack." He didn't waste any more words. He walked to the edge of the creek bed and slid down the short, steep incline, his boots dislodging a cascade of dry pebbles. He knelt by the trapped wheel, examining the way the earth had crumbled and locked it in place. The axle was groaning under the skewed weight of the wagon. Pushing would be useless without leverage. He scanned the area, his gaze landing on a pile of discarded lumber near the dilapidated bridge. He climbed back out, walked over, and selected a thick, heavy plank of wood. "Get back on the seat," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Hold the reins tight. When I tell you, give the horse a sharp command. Don't let up." Eliza hesitated for only a second before climbing back onto the driver's bench. Her hands, though small, looked capable as they gripped the worn leather reins. She watched as Luke slid the plank into the crevice beside the wheel, positioning it carefully to act as a fulcrum. He then wedged a smaller, solid block of wood beneath it. He braced himself, his back and legs tensing as he put his full weight onto the end of the plank, using it as a lever. "Now," he grunted, the single word a sharp crack in the hot, still air. Eliza snapped the reins, her voice clear and firm. "Hup, Bess, pull." The horse, Bess, strained forward, its muscles bunching. The wagon creaked and groaned in protest. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The wheel remained stubbornly fixed, a prisoner of the earth. Sweat dripped from Luke's forehead, tracing clean paths through the grime on his temples. He could feel the wood of the lever begin to splinter under the immense pressure. Inside the Cinder Creek saloon, a few men had paused their game of cards to watch the scene through the swinging doors. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies. It was a haven from the sun, but not from the town's suffocating boredom. "Well, looky there." One of them, a lanky man named Jeb, drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Harrow's found himself another piece of bad luck to wrangle." His companion, a portly man with a perpetually sour expression, spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "That family's cursed. I tell you, nothing but trouble follows them. His brother, Wade, takes a fall down Black Canyon last year. Their well goes dry 2 months ago. Now this, anyone gets too close to a harrow, ends up stuck in a ditch one way or another." Jeb chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "She's a pretty thing to be stuck with, though. Prettiness don't pay the bills," the other man grumbled, turning back to his cards. "And it sure as hell don't break a curse." Outside, the curse, or whatever it was, seemed to be losing its grip. With a final, agonizing shriek of wood and metal, the wheel tore free from the earth. The wagon lurched forward violently. Suddenly released from its trap, the sudden movement was accompanied by a deep, resonant crack as the fissure in the creek bed, weakened by their efforts, widened under the strain. The ground beneath Eliza's feet, where she had been standing just moments before, crumbled away. The jolt sent her off balance. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of surprise, as her boots slipped on the loose gravel. She tumbled sideways off the bench, not toward the soft dust of the road, but toward the newly deepened crack in the creek bed. Luke moved with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He dropped the now useless lever and lunged forward, his arm shooting out. He caught her around the waist, his grip firm and unyielding, pulling her back from the edge. He held her against him for a moment, her body pressed against his, the momentum of her fall absorbed by his solid frame. The world seemed to stop for a beat. The dust settled. The horses stood panting, and the only sound was the frantic beating of Eliza's heart against his chest. His hand was splayed across the small of her back. It was a simple, protective gesture, nothing more. But for Eliza, the contact was like a bolt of lightning. A tremor, violent and uncontrollable, ran through her hand where it was braced against his torn shirt. It wasn't a tremble of fear, not of him or of the fall. It was something else entirely, a ghost from a different time and a different place. The sensation of being held still, of a man's strength containing her, didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a memory, a dark, suffocating memory of a locked door and a grip that was not gentle, of a will that was not her own. The past, a thing she kept carefully folded and tucked away like old linen, had just been shaken loose. Luke felt the tremor and mistook it for fear. He released her immediately. Stepping back to give her space, he saw the color drain from her face, the way her gray eyes widened with an emotion he couldn't name. He saw her composure, so steady just moments before, shatter like fragile glass. She steadied herself, one hand gripping the side of the wagon, her knuckles white. "Thank you," she said, but the words were barely a whisper, a thread of sound nearly lost in the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. Luke just gave a short, sharp nod. He didn't know what to do with her shattered expression or the strange, palpable fear that now hung between them. Words of comfort were not a currency he traded in. He turned away, his own discomfort a sharp, pointed thing in his gut. He grabbed the reins of his horse, his movements brisk and efficient, and led the animal across the rickety wooden bridge that spanned the creek, the rest of his herd following dutifully behind. He didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury he couldn't afford. Eliza watched him go, the dust swirling around his retreating figure. She raised a trembling hand to her waist, to the spot where he had held her. The fabric of her dress still felt warm from his touch. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force the unwelcome memory back into its box. She was safe, she was free, but the past had long fingers, and it had just reminded her how easily it could reach out and touch her. From the shaded veranda of the Cinder Creek Bank and Loan, Silas Vexen watched the entire exchange through narrowed eyes. He sat in a high-backed rocking chair, a tall glass of lemonade sweating on the small table beside him. Vexen was a man who thrived in the heat, his demeanor as cool and crisp as his starched white collar. He saw everything that happened in his town. He saw Luke Harrow, a man whose family name was deep in his debt ledger. He saw the strange woman with the stuck wagon. He saw the small act of assistance to Vexen. Every interaction was a transaction, every event an opportunity. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his lemonade. Then, with a thin, bloodless smile that did not reach his cold eyes, he picked up a pen and the small, leather-bound ledger from the table. He opened it to the page marked Harrow, L, and, in his neat, precise script, made a new entry. He wrote, "Road and Bridge Maintenance Fee. Assistance rendered." He did not assign a dollar amount. Not yet. He would let the debt accrue interest, just like all the others. He closed the book with a soft snap, the sound of another small lock clicking into place, and continued to rock, watching as the dust slowly settled back onto the quiet, struggling streets of his town. Cinder Creek did not offer welcomes. It offered assessments. Eliza Hart learned this in the days following her ordeal at the creek bed. The town watched her with a collective, sidelong glance, its judgment as fine and pervasive as the dust. She needed a place to work, a space to anchor her transient life, if only for a season. The livery stable owner, a man whose kindness was buried under layers of weary pragmatism, offered her a deal. For a modest sum, she could have a corner of the old granary. The space was not much, a forgotten pocket of the building where the sweet, earthy smell of 1,000 past harvests still clung to the wooden walls. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes of dust, squeezed through the gaps in the siding, striping the floor in pale gold. It was quiet, save for the cooing of pigeons in the rafters and the distant, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. For Eliza, it was a sanctuary. She swept the floor clean, her broom whispering against the smooth-worn planks. She unpacked her treadle sewing machine, its black iron body and gilded decals a stark, elegant contrast to the rustic wood. It was the one constant in her life, a heavy, reliable friend whose needle could stitch together the frayed edges of her world. She strung a line from one wall to another, and soon it was filled. A farmer's canvas coat with a neatly patched elbow, a child's pinafore with a reattached strap, a set of flour sack curtains hemmed with impossibly straight, even stitches. Each mended item was a small victory, a piece of order brought to a world that tended toward unraveling. The granary became her small kingdom of repair, a place where things that were broken could be made whole again. While Eliza stitched new seams, Luke Harrow stared at old debts. He sat at his father's roll-top desk, a piece of furniture too fine for the rustic ranch house, a relic of a more prosperous time. Before him lay the stud ledger, its leather cover cracked and softened with age. He turned the pages. The thick, creamy paper whispering under his calloused thumb. The early entries were in his father's hand, a strong, confident script that spoke of hope and good breeding stock. Then came his brother Wade's scrawl, looser and more hurried, full of plans and calculations. Finally, there was his own hand, tight and economical, and next to his entries, the numbers written in red ink. The figures swam before his eyes, each one a drop of blood on the page. The price of feed had doubled after the drought. 2 of his best mares had lost their foals during the last hard winter. A promising young stallion had broken its leg in a gopher hole and had to be put down. Each loss, each setback, was recorded here in stark, unforgiving crimson. The red was the color of a warning, the color of a fire line hastily chalked on the ground in a desperate attempt to stop an advancing blaze. He was standing behind that line now, and the flames were getting closer. He could feel the heat on his face, the suffocating smoke of failure filling his lungs. This land, this herd, this name, it was all he had left of his family. The ledger wasn't just a book of accounts. It was a testament to a legacy he felt slipping through his fingers like fine, dry dust. In the saloon, the talk flowed as freely as the whiskey. The Harrow name was a favorite topic, a story to be savored and embellished with each telling. "It's a shadow over that land," Jeb insisted, nursing a warm beer. "Always has been. You remember old man Harrow worked himself into an early grave trying to keep that place afloat?" The sour-faced man, whose name was Bartholomew, slammed his empty glass on the bar. "The land ain't the problem. It's the blood. That family's got a knack for finding the sharpest edge of any trouble. Look at Wade, smartest horseman in the territory. They said knows the canyons like the back of his hand. Then one day, he just slips. On a patch of loose rock he's crossed 100 times. Don't make sense." "They found him at the bottom of Black Canyon," Jeb added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Broken like a twig. Luke was the one who had to carry him out. They say he didn't speak for a week after. And the horses." Bartholomew grunted, signaling the bartender for another whiskey. "You hear about the mares? 2 lost foals? Just gone. That ain't just bad luck. That's a blight, a curse, the Harrow curse. And now this new woman, the seamstress. First thing that happens when she gets here, her wagon gets swallowed by the earth right at the edge of his property. You mark my words. She's tangled in it now. She'll be sorry she ever laid eyes on Cinder Creek." Eliza heard the whispers. She felt the curious, pitying stares as she walked to the general store for thread. The women would fall silent as she approached, their conversations dying like embers in a sudden draft. But she was no stranger to being an outsider. She kept her head high, her gaze focused, and her words polite and few. A few days after she had set up her shop, she was walking back from the creek where she washed her few linens. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, a habit born of a lifetime of watching her step. That's when she saw it, half buried in the dried mud near where her wagon had been stuck. Something glinted in the harsh afternoon sun. She knelt and worked it free from the hard-packed earth. It was a small, silver concho, intricately stamped with a pattern of curling leaves. In the center, framed by the silver work, were the initials WH. It was a saddle badge, the kind a man would prize, a small piece of identity and pride. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, who it must have belonged to. She found Luke at the town well later that day, drawing water for his horses. He worked with a grim, relentless efficiency, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted energy. His shoulders were broad under the faded shirt, and the muscles in his back and arms coiled and uncoiled with each turn of the crank. He looked rooted to the earth, as solid and unyielding as the rock formations that dotted the landscape. Eliza waited until he had finished, not wanting to interrupt his labor. When he straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, she approached him quietly. "Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice soft. He turned, his expression guarded, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He didn't seem to recognize her for a moment, and then a flicker of something memory, or perhaps annoyance, passed over his face. "Ma'am?" She held out her hand, the silver concho resting in her palm. "I believe this is yours, or it belonged to your family. I found it by the creek." Luke stared at the object in her hand. His whole body went still. He reached out and took the badge, his rough fingers closing around it with a strange reverence. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing the engraved initials, W.H. Wade Harrow. His brother had been so proud of that concho, a gift from their father on his 18th birthday. He had lost it months before he died, had been angry with himself for his carelessness. "Where did you say you found this?" he asked, his voice low and thick with an emotion he was trying to suppress. "Near the bridge, where my wagon was stuck," she replied gently. He looked up from the concho, and for the first time, she saw past the hard exterior. His eyes were not just stormy, they were filled with a swirling, impenetrable smoke, the smoke of memory, of loss, of a pain so deep it had become a part of his very being. He looked haunted. "Thank you," he said. The words seemed to cost him a great deal, as if they were stones he had to dredge up from the bottom of a deep, dark well. He closed his fist around the concho, the metal pressing into his palm. Without another word, he turned and led his horse away, his back a rigid line of unspoken grief. Eliza watched him go, a profound sadness settling over her. She knew that look. She had seen a version of it in her own reflection. It was the look of someone who was carrying a past that was heavier than any physical burden. The very next morning, as Luke was loading sacks of grain onto his wagon, a polished buggy pulled up in a cloud of dust. Silas Vexen stepped out, looking immaculate and out of place amidst the grit of the Harrow ranch. "Harrow," Vexen said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Just making my weekly rounds. Wanted to see how things were progressing." "They're progressing," Luke said flatly, not stopping his work. "Are they?" Vexen asked, a thin smile playing on his lips. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Because my ledger tells a different story. It tells a story of late payments, of dwindling assets, of misfortune." He let the word hang in the air. "The bank has been more than patient, given your family's long history in this valley, but our patience, like your line of credit, is finite." Luke stopped, turning to face the banker. "What do you want?" "Vexen." "Full payment on the overdue note," Vexen said, his smile never wavering. "You have 1 week, 7 days. If the full amount is not on my desk by noon next Monday, I will have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings. The Harrow Ranch will become the property of the Cinder Creek Bank and Loan." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It's nothing personal, you understand. It's just business." Luke's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples. 1 week. It was an impossible deadline. He knew it, and he knew Vexen knew it. This wasn't business. This was a death sentence. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, a small group of children appeared at the door of Eliza's granary. A little girl with wide, solemn eyes held up a cloth doll with a ripped arm. A boy with a smattering of freckles across his nose held out a leather satchel with a broken strap. "Can you fix 'em, miss?" he asked, his voice hopeful. A genuine smile touched Eliza's lips, softening the weary lines around her eyes. "Of course I can," she said, her voice warm. She took the doll and the satchel, her hands moving with a practiced, gentle competence. She sat them down on a low stool and went to work, her needle flying, her hands as quick and sure as a hummingbird's wings. The children watched, mesmerized, as she stitched the doll's arm back on, as she repaired the satchel's strap with a piece of strong, waxed thread. She talked to them as she worked, asking them their names, telling them a story about a brave little mouse who sailed across a puddle on a leaf. For a little while, the dusty corner of the granary was filled with a light and warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. As she finished the last stitch, the sound of the church bell began to toll, its heavy bronze notes rolling across the quiet town. It was meant to be a call to evening prayer, a sound of comfort and peace. But tonight, to Eliza, it sounded different. Each slow, deliberate peal was like the stroke of a hammer, like the counting of a debt. It marked the end of another day, another step closer to a reckoning she knew was coming. Not just for Luke Harrow, but for all of them, living on the edge in a town held together by fraying threads. That night, by the soft, flickering light of a single oil lamp, Eliza opened a small, cloth-bound journal. She dipped her pen in a pot of ink and wrote, her elegant script flowing across the page. The people here whisper of a curse on the Harrow name. She wrote, they see only the snags, the tears in the fabric of a family's life. But a tear is not an ending. The past is a stitch. If you pull the thread just right, with a steady hand and a strong needle, the cloth stops tearing. You can make it whole again. The darkness in Cinder Creek was not a gentle blanket. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the ghosts of the day's heat and the silence of a town holding its breath. Luke Harrow was a light sleeper, a habit born from years of listening for the telltale cough of a sick foal or the stealthy pad of a coyote. Tonight, a different sound pulled him from the shallow depths of his rest. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, rhythmic grating of metal on wood, a sound that did not belong in the night's quiet symphony. He was out of his cot and had his boots on before he was fully awake, his body moving with an instinct that bypassed thought. He grabbed the old shotgun leaning by the door, its weight familiar and grim in his hands. He moved through the house without a sound, a shadow within shadows, and slipped out the back door. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, but his eyes were accustomed to the dark. He scanned the corral. The horses were restless, their dark shapes shifting and stamping in the gloom. They knew something was wrong. Their anxiety was a current in the air, a low hum of animal fear. His gaze fixed on the barn, the large door, which should have been secured by a thick wooden latch and a heavy iron pin, was slightly ajar. The grating sound had stopped. It was replaced by an unnerving silence. He moved toward it, his steps light on the hard-packed earth, the shotgun held ready. As he drew closer, he saw it. The thick wooden crossbar had been neatly severed. The cut was clean, precise, not the work of an axe or a pry bar. It was the work of a saw, a fine-toothed blade that had moved with quiet efficiency. Suddenly, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows near the barn and sprinted away, heading for the open rangeland behind the property. It was a fleeting glimpse, a human form cloaked in darkness, moving with a desperate, furtive speed. Rage, cold and sharp, surged through Luke. This was not a random act of vandalism. This was a violation, another calculated tear in the already threadbare fabric of his life. He didn't shout, he didn't waste the breath. He ran, he pumped his legs, his long strides eating up the ground, the shotgun now a cumbersome weight in his hands. The figure ahead was fast, weaving through the sparse sagebrush that dotted the landscape. Luke was faster. He was powered by a fury that had been simmering for months. A fury over the lost foals, the dry well, the mounting debts, and the ever-present ghost of his brother. The ground was treacherous, riddled with unseen dips and animal burrows. The fleeing shadow seemed to know the terrain, or perhaps was just luckier. As Luke closed the distance, his boot came down on a patch of loose shale. His ankle twisted, and he pitched forward, not onto the flat ground, but into the darkness of a shallow, dry wash that cut through his property. The fall was jarring, a brutal, sudden stop. He landed hard on his left side, the impact driving the air from his lungs. A searing pain, white-hot and immediate, shot through his left shoulder. It was a familiar agony, a ghost of an old injury, awakened and roaring with new life. The shotgun flew from his grasp, skittering into the darkness. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the world a dizzying swirl of pain and blackness. The sound of the intruder's footsteps faded into the distance. He had lost him. He pushed himself up, his left arm useless, a dead weight hanging at his side. He gritted his teeth against the wave of nausea that washed over him. As he got to his knees, his hand braced against the side of the wash. He felt something slick and cool beneath his palm. He looked down. In the faint moonlight, he could see his hand was smeared with a thick, sticky mud. It was an odd color, not the rich red or brown of the local soil, but a pale, ashen gray. And then, time fractured. The scent of the gray mud filled his nostrils, and he was no longer in the dry wash behind his barn. He was standing on a high, narrow ledge in Black Canyon, the wind a mournful cry in his ears. The sun was bright, too bright, glinting off the sheer rock faces. Below him, his brother, Wade, lay twisted and broken on the canyon floor. The memory was so vivid, so complete, that he could feel the phantom chill of the canyon air on his skin, could hear the terrible, unnatural silence that had followed his brother's fall. He remembered scrambling down the treacherous slope, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, praying, bargaining with a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He remembered kneeling beside Wade, seeing the life fade from his eyes. And he remembered the mud, on the very spot where Wade's boot had slipped, where the solid rock had inexplicably given way. There had been a smear of the same pale, ashen gray mud. At the time, in the fog of his shock and grief, it had been a meaningless detail, an insignificant observation lost in the overwhelming tragedy. He had assumed it was just a patch of wet clay from a hidden spring, but there were no springs on that ledge. He knew that canyon better than he knew the lines on his own hand. The memory dissolved, leaving him kneeling in the dirt. The pain in his shoulder, a throbbing anchor to the present. The gray mud. It wasn't a coincidence. A curse didn't leave footprints. A blight didn't use a saw. What had happened to Wade? What was happening to him now? It wasn't the work of fate or bad luck. It was the work of a man. Eliza was awake. The sound of a man running in the night, followed by a heavy thud and a choked cry of pain, had pierced the thin walls of her room at the boarding house. She had lit her lamp and waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. When she saw the light in Luke Harrow's house flicker on nearly an hour later, she acted without thinking. She pulled a shawl around her shoulders, grabbed the small first aid kit she always kept with her, and slipped out into the night. She found him sitting at his kitchen table, stripped to the waist, trying clumsily to clean a long, deep scrape along his left shoulder with his right hand. The skin was raw and bleeding, embedded with dirt and gravel. His face was pale and tight with pain. He didn't seem surprised to see her, only weary, as if he had no energy left for questions. "Let me," she said softly, taking the wet rag from his hand. He didn't protest. He just sat there, his good arm resting on the table, his head bowed. Eliza set her kit on the table. She put a small pot of water on the stove to boil and added a handful of dried leaves from a small cloth bag. The sharp, clean scent of wormwood soon filled the small kitchen, a medicinal smell that spoke of healing. She worked in silence, her movements gentle and efficient. She used the warm, herb-infused water to clean the wound, carefully picking out the bits of gravel with a pair of tweezers. Her touch was light, impersonal, yet profoundly steady. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't offer words of sympathy or alarm. She simply tended to the wound, her entire focus on the task at hand. Her quiet, capable presence was more comforting than any words could have been. Luke watched her hands as they worked. They were small and deft, the hands of a seamstress, accustomed to mending and repairing. The lamplight softened the lines of her face, catching the stray wisps of dark hair that had escaped her braid. He watched her expression of deep concentration, the way her brow furrowed slightly. Her eyes, when they occasionally met his, held no pity, no curiosity, and most importantly, no judgment. They were just present. They saw his pain, his vulnerability, and they did not flinch. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the lamp and the gentle splash of water. It was the kind of silence that invited truth. "I'm afraid to touch anything," he said, the words coming out in a low, ragged whisper. He wasn't looking at her, but at the scarred wooden surface of the table, or anyone. Eliza paused her work, her hand hovering over his shoulder. She waited, listening. "My father," he continued, his voice thick with unshed grief. "He worked this land until his heart gave out. I touched him, and he was gone. My brother, he was the best part of this place. He knew the horses, he knew the seasons. I was with him that day. I touched him, and he was gone. This ranch, these horses, I touch them, and they sicken and fail. Everything I try to hold on to, it turns to dust in my hands." He finally looked up at her, his eyes a raw landscape of loss. "I lose everything I touch." His confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, broken thing. He was not just talking about a curse. He was talking about a profound and terrifying loneliness, a fear of connection so deep it had become the bedrock of his existence. He was afraid to hope, afraid to care, because he believed his very touch brought ruin. Eliza looked at him, at the raw wound on his shoulder and the deeper, invisible wound in his eyes. She saw the proud, self-sufficient cowboy, the man who had pulled her wagon from the mud, stripped bare to reveal a man terrified of his own capacity to cause pain. She finished cleaning the wound and began to carefully bandage it with clean strips of linen. "A wound needs to be held still to heal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, so does a person." The wind picked up outside, rattling the corrugated tin roof of the small house. The sound was lonely and desolate. In the distance, the faint, rhythmic sound of a horse's hooves could be heard, a lone rider moving across the plains. Usually, it was a comforting sound, a sign of life in the vast emptiness. But tonight, it sounded different. It sounded like a heartbeat, unsteady and quickening, a harbinger of things to come. As Eliza tied off the bandage, her fingers brushing against his skin, a thought, clear and sharp as her finest needle, formed in her mind. Luke saw his past as a series of irreparable breaks, a chain of losses that could never be reclaimed. He believed himself to be an agent of that destruction, but she saw it differently. She saw the pain, the grief, the fear, not as endings, but as tangled threads in a complex pattern. If the past is a seam, she thought, her hands steady as she secured the final knot, it can be unstitched. It can be sewn again. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, a quiet truce between hope and hardship. Eliza's corner of the granary became a small beacon of order in the dusty chaos of Cinder Creek. The townsfolk, initially wary, began to trust the quiet competence of her hands. They brought her their torn work clothes, their children's ripped blankets, their faded Sunday best, and she mended them all with a skill that was both an art and a prayer. Each repaired seam was a small act of defiance against the decay that seemed to hang over the town. Luke, meanwhile, worked his land with a grim determination, the specter of Vexen's deadline a constant shadow at his back. He mended fences, reshod horses, and tallied his meager assets, searching for a miracle in the stark arithmetic of his predicament. The night she had tended to his wound had changed something between them. A silent understanding now existed, a shared language of acknowledged pain that required no words. He would find a bucket of fresh water left near his door in the morning. She would find a neatly stacked pile of firewood beside her granary in the evening. They were two solitary planets that had drifted into a shared orbit, circling the same quiet sun of mutual respect. On the third day after the incident at the barn, Eliza was making a delivery to the Miller farm, on the far side of town. She had bundled a set of mended curtains and a patched quilt into a canvas carryall. The sky that morning had been a pale, washed-out blue, but by afternoon, a strange, sickly yellow haze had begun to bleed across the horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an electric tension. The birds fell silent. It was the kind of ominous quiet that precedes violence. She was halfway back to town, walking along the open road that ran parallel to the creek bed. When the wind hit, it did not rise gradually. It fell upon the landscape like a physical blow. One moment there was stillness. The next, a solid wall of air and dust moving at a terrifying speed. The yellow haze consumed the sky, and the world was plunged into a suffocating, ochre twilight. The dust wasn't the fine powder she was used to. It was a storm of hard, sharp particles that stung her exposed skin and abraded her eyes like fine ground glass. She raised an arm to shield her face, her bonnet torn from her head and sent tumbling into the maelstrom. And then came the sound. It was a low, deep moan at first, the sound of the world groaning in agony. But as the wind intensified, the moan rose to a guttural roar, then a high, terrifying shriek as it tore through the narrow gaps between the town's buildings. It was a sound of pure, elemental fury, the sound of something immense and powerful trying to tear the world apart. For Eliza, it was not the wind. It was the sound of a heavy oak door slamming shut. It was the deafening boom that had echoed in a small, windowless room. The final, terrible punctuation mark to the loss of her freedom. It was the sound of a thick iron bolt sliding home, the metallic scrape that had sealed her in darkness, a sound that had become the rhythm of her nightmares. Her breath hitched in her throat. The air, already thick with dust, seemed to turn to solid mud in her lungs. Her vision narrowed to a single point, the swirling red dust before her eyes. The rational part of her mind knew it was a sandstorm, a natural, if violent, phenomenon of the plains, but the deeper, wounded part of her, the part that lived in a perpetually locked room, knew only the sound. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. The granary, her small sanctuary, seemed 1,000 miles away. The open road, a symbol of her hard-won freedom, suddenly felt like the most exposed, the most dangerous place in the world. She was trapped. She couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. Through the blinding curtain of dust, a shape emerged, solid and dark. It was Luke, riding low on his horse, his hat pulled down, his body a bulwark against the storm. He must have seen her from his property. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop, leaving the animal to stand its ground, its head lowered against the wind. He strode toward her, his face a grim mask against the onslaught. "The barn!" he shouted, his voice nearly ripped away by the wind. "This way!" He reached for her arm, but she flinched, a small, involuntary recoil. He saw the pure, unadulterated terror in her eyes, an expression that had nothing to do with the storm. It was a deeper, older fear. Understanding dawned, swift and intuitive. This wasn't about the wind or the dust. It was about the noise. He didn't pull her. Instead, he moved to her side, positioning his body to shield her from the worst of the wind. He placed a hand, broad and firm, on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of possession or command. It was an anchor, a point of stillness in a world that was violently shaking itself apart. He began to guide her, not by force, but by a steady, unwavering pressure, toward the dark, gaping doorway of his barn. They stumbled inside, and the sudden drop in the wind's intensity was a physical relief. The shrieking lowered to a deafening roar outside the thick timber walls. Dust still swirled in through the gaps, but here, in the semi-darkness, they were sheltered. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horseflesh filled the air, a scent of life and labor that was a stark contrast to the sterile fury outside. Eliza leaned against the rough-hewn wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her lungs burned, each breath a shallow, ragged gasp. The roaring of the wind was still the sound of the slamming door, and the barn, which should have felt like a refuge, felt like another cage. The tremors racked her frame, violent and unstoppable. Luke stood before her, his large frame blocking the doorway, a solid silhouette against the swirling chaos outside. He kept his hand on her shoulder, a point of constant, steady warmth. He felt the fine, violent shudders that ran through her, the frantic pulse of her fear. She squeezed her eyes shut, a low, choked moan escaping her lips. "You're not just holding my body," she gasped, the words torn from her, raw and broken. "You're holding my past. You're keeping it from shattering." The confession, wrested from the depths of her panic, was the bravest thing he had ever heard. He understood then that her trembling was not just a physical reaction. It was the shaking of a soul reliving an old trauma, His own fears, his belief in his own destructive touch seemed small and selfish in the face of her agony. His instinct was not to pull away, but to hold on, to offer what little stability he possessed. He knelt slightly, bringing his face level with hers. Though her eyes were still tightly closed, his voice, when he spoke, was low and calm, a rudder in the storm of her terror. "One," he said, his voice a quiet anchor in the roaring wind. "Two, breathe with me, Eliza, just breathe." He took a slow, deliberate breath, loud enough for her to hear over the storm and the frantic drumming in her own ears. "Inhale, exhale." "Again," he urged gently. "One, two, breathe with me." She tried. Her first attempt was a ragged, shuddering gasp, but his hand was still on her shoulder, a constant, unwavering presence. His voice was a steady rhythm. The solidness of him, the simple, undeniable fact of his presence, began to cut through the fog of her memory. He was not the man from her past. His touch was not a prelude to pain. It was a shield against it. She focused on the sound of his breathing, on the simple count. 1, 2. She matched her breath to his. A slow inhale that still burned. A shaky exhale that released a fraction of the tension. Again. 1, 2. Their breathing began to sink, a shared rhythm in the heart of the storm. The roaring of the wind outside began to recede, to separate itself from the memory of the slamming door. It was just wind. The barn was just a barn, and the hand on her shoulder was just a hand, strong and steady and safe. Slowly, the violent trembling subsided, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The storm outside began to lose its fury, its shriek diminishing to a low, mournful howl. Eliza's breathing was still uneven, but it was her own again. She opened her eyes. Luke was still there, his gaze filled with a quiet, unwavering concern. The wind finally died down, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. The world outside the barn door was coated in a fresh layer of red dust, the light soft and diffused as if after a snowfall. Eliza pushed herself away from the wall, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She rested her forehead against one of the massive wooden support posts, the rough, cool timber a comfort against her skin. She felt utterly drained, but also strangely light. There was no shame, no embarrassment, only a vast, quiet relief. A sudden gust of wind, a last gasp from the dying storm, swirled through the barn. It caught Luke's hat, which he had set on a barrel, and sent it cartwheeling out the door and into a muddy puddle. They both watched it go, a dark felt circle settling ignominiously in the red water. A small, watery chuckle escaped Eliza's lips. It was a fragile sound, but it was genuine. Luke looked at her, and a slow smile touched his own mouth, reaching his eyes and chasing some of the shadows from them. He looked back at his ruined hat. "Well," he said, his voice raspy, "I suppose it needed a wash." They shared a moment of quiet, unassuming laughter. It was a small thing, a shared smile over a lost hat. But in the aftermath of the storm, both inside and out, it felt monumental. It was the first stitch in a new kind of seam, one woven not from shared pain, but from a shared moment of peace. By evening, the story had already been twisted by the town's rumor mill. Jeb and Bartholomew, nursing their whiskeys in the saloon, had their own version of events. "Saw it with my own eyes," Jeb declared, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The storm hits, and she goes running straight for his barn, crying and carrying on. Threw herself right into his arms, said something about him holding her and refusing to let go." "See?" Bartholomew grunted, slamming his glass down. "The curse, it pulls him in. She's trapped now, just like the rest of 'em. He's got his hooks in her. She'll be another harrow misfortune before the first snow falls." When Luke heard the whispers the next day at the mercantile, a familiar, cold anger settled in his gut. His first instinct was to retreat, to pull back from Eliza, to put a distance between them to protect her from the town's poisonous gossip, and, perhaps, from himself. He found her in the granary, her hands busy mending a canvas tarp, her movements calm and restored. "You've heard what they're saying," he said, his voice low and tight. "I have," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Maybe it's best if I keep my distance," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I don't want my trouble becoming yours." Eliza stopped her sewing. She looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and direct. There was a new strength in her gaze, a resolve forged in the heart of the storm. "Let them talk, Luke," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They can mend their stories with lies and twist them into any shape they please. We'll mend what's real. Let them talk. We will live." That night, they sat before the small stone fireplace in his house. A fire crackled and spat, casting a warm, dancing light that pushed the shadows into the corners. The silence between them was no longer one of caution, but of comfort. The whispers of the town, the ghosts of their pasts, seemed far away, unable to penetrate the small circle of warmth and light. It was Luke who spoke first, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the flames. He told her about Wade, not as a symbol of a curse, but as a brother. He spoke of his loud laugh, of his uncanny ability to calm a spooked horse, of their shared dream to buy the neighboring valley. He spoke of the day he fell, of the unnatural silence of the canyon, and of the single, haunting detail of the strange, gray mud. He laid the story out, piece by piece, like precious, broken things he was finally trusting someone else to see. When he was finished, Eliza looked into the fire, her own memories flickering in its depths, and for the first time, she gave voice to the source of her own deep wound. She spoke of a town far away, of a business arrangement that had turned into a trap. She spoke not of a man, but of a room, a small room with a heavy oak door. She spoke of the sound of the bolt, the suffocating darkness, and the long, silent days of waiting for a rescue that only came when she finally found the strength to break the window and climb out herself. They did not whisper. Their voices were quiet, but clear and steady in the warm, firelit room. They were just two people, sharing the weight of their pasts, and in the sharing, making it lighter. The seams of their old lives, pulled and torn by pain and loss, were finally being unstitched, ready to be sewn anew. The firelight conversation had changed the air between them. It had burned away the fog of rumor and unspoken grief, leaving a stark, clear landscape of shared truth. The idea of a curse, a form of malignant fate, had evaporated. In its place stood the cold, hard silhouette of a man. Their separate pains were no longer random acts of a cruel universe. They were connected threads, and the needle was in Silas Vexen's hand. The question was no longer why, but how. How to prove that the shadows they lived in were being cast by design. Their investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet snip of scissors. A few days later, a man named Peterson, one of the town's handymen who occasionally served as a night watchman, brought Eliza his heavy canvas work coat. A long, ugly tear ran down the sleeve, the result of a snag on a nail, he said. As Eliza laid the garment out on her workbench, she saw it was not the only point of damage. Near the cuff, a clumsy, hurried repair had been made, the stitches large and uneven. But it was the thread itself that caught her expert eye. It was new, unlike the rest of the aging coat, and it felt slightly stiff, almost waxy. She leaned closer, her sense of smell so attuned to the nuances of her craft, detecting a faint, sharp aroma. It was the clean, metallic scent of machine oil. It was a peculiar detail. Thread was sometimes waxed for strength, but this was different. This was the smell of a well-oiled mechanism, the kind of lubricant used to keep gears and levers moving smoothly. Why would anyone oil a spool of sewing thread? She worked the strange thread between her fingers. It was strong, almost unnaturally so. The scent, the texture, it unlocked a memory, a fleeting image from a few weeks prior. She had gone into Vexen's bank to change a large bill into smaller currency for her customers. Vexen had been momentarily called away, and through the open door to his back storeroom, her eyes had taken in the scene. It was a place of meticulous order, stacks of ledgers and boxes aligned with geometric precision. But on a low shelf, amidst the clutter of spare inkwells and paperweights. She had seen a large, dusty spool of unusually thick thread. She had only noted it peripherally, a professional curiosity. Its color had been odd, not a true brown or gray, but a pale, lifeless grayish tan. The color of sun-baked river clay, the color of dead ash, the color he had described. She closed her eyes, and the image in her memory sharpened. The dusty, grayish-tan spool in Vexen's storeroom, the smear of ashen mud Luke had found on the canyon ledge where Wade fell, the same mud he had found in the wash after chasing the intruder from his barn. The threads in her mind began to pull together, forming a tight, ugly knot of suspicion. She shared her thoughts with Luke that evening, her voice low and steady in the quiet of the granary. He listened intently, his face carved into hard lines by the fading light. He looked at his own hands, remembering the feel of that slick, gray mud. A seamstress's thread and a dead man's fall. It seemed an impossible connection, but in the brittle atmosphere of Cinder Creek, the impossible was becoming plausible. "A thread is not enough," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We need the tool that made the cut." The next morning, Luke walked into the Cinder Creek General Store. The place smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, was a small, meticulous man who polished his spectacles with a nervous energy, as if he could wipe away the town's grime through sheer force of will. "Abernathy," Luke said, his voice calm, "I need to ask you about a saw." Abernathy looked up, his eyes wary over the top of his spectacles. "Many kinds of saws. Luke, crosscut, rip, bow." "A hacksaw," Luke clarified. "One with a fine, thin blade, for cutting metal, or a thick pin." The storekeeper's Adam's apple bobbed. "That's a specific item. Not much call for him." He busied himself rearranging a display of canned peaches. "Can't say I recall selling one recently." Luke didn't move. He just stood there, his presence filling the narrow aisle. He was not an intimidating man by nature, but his grief and anger had forged a new kind of intensity around him, a stillness that was more unsettling than any threat. "Your ledger," Luke said, his voice flat. "You note down every significant sale. A saw like that would be significant." Abernathy sighed, his shoulders slumping. He knew as well as anyone that arguing with Luke Harrow these days was like arguing with a cliff face. He shuffled to the counter and pulled out a large, leather-bound book, its pages filled with his spidery, precise script. He licked his thumb and began to turn the pages, the dry paper whispering in the quiet store. He ran a bony finger down a list of entries. He stopped. He read the line, then read it again, as if disbelieving his own writing. He looked up at Luke, his face pale. "Here it is," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sold 2 weeks ago. One fine-toothed utility saw." "Who bought it?" Luke asked, his own voice dangerously quiet. Abernathy swallowed hard before answering. "Caleb Thorne." The name landed like a stone in a still pond. Caleb Thorne was a drifter, a man with no visible means of support, who was nonetheless always solvent, a man whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder, and in Cinder Creek, the highest bidder was always Silas Vexen. Luke asked to see the entry. Abernathy, eager to be rid of him, turned the book around. There it was, in black and white. The item, the price, and Thorne's crude, barely legible signature on the line. Luke had the tool. Now he needed to connect it to the place. That night, under the sliver of a moon, he and Eliza lay concealed in a thicket of overgrown brush on the low ridge overlooking the back of the bank. The air was cold, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. The rear of the bank was a stark, uninviting wall that sloped down to a wide, muddy embankment designed to prevent flooding from the creek during the rare wet season. 4 hours. They saw nothing. Then, just as the moon was beginning to set, 2 figures emerged from the bank's back door. It was Thorne and another man Luke recognized as one of Vexen's hangers-on. They weren't carrying anything, but they moved with a furtive purpose. They walked down to the embankment and began working on a section of wooden retaining wall. Luke watched their movements. His eyes narrowed. They were stacking new sandbags, their canvas shells a pale color in the gloom. Some of the bags were secured to the wooden wall with heavy iron nails, driven in with a few efficient hammer blows. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He was a rancher, a builder. He had spent his life driving nails, building fences, repairing stalls. He knew the way a man swings a hammer, the unique pattern of dents and scrapes the head leaves in the wood, the marks he had found on the sawn-through crossbar of his barn door. The small, incidental damage around the cut had a specific character. From this distance, he couldn't be certain, but the rhythm of the hammer blows, the way the men braced the wood, it was all disturbingly familiar. They weren't just shoring up a wall, they were practicing, or perhaps they were replenishing their supply of the unique, ashen mud that filled those bags. The final thread came from a place of faith. The next afternoon, Eliza put on her best dress and went to see Father Michael at the small clapboard church. She found him tending to a small garden of wilted rose bushes. He was a kind man, his spirit gentler than the harsh land he served. "Father," Eliza began, her voice respectful, "I have been so moved by the generosity of this town, and I wish to contribute what little I can. I was wondering, as Mr. Vexen is such a pillar of the community, if I might see the church's donation ledger. I'd like to understand the town's needs better, to see where my own small contribution might do the most good." The priest, pleased by her piety and civic-mindedness, readily agreed. Inside the cool, quiet church, he produced the ledger. As Eliza turned the pages, she saw what she expected: regular, generous donations from Silas Vexen. But then, her eyes caught on a series of unusual entries, notations made in Vexen's own crisp hand. They were listed as civic contributions, but the descriptions were more specific: road and bridge maintenance fee. The sums were staggering, far more than the upkeep of the town's simple dirt roads and single rickety bridge could ever cost. And they were collected not just from Vexen himself, but noted as paid by dozens of townsfolk, small ranchers and farmers, people she knew were struggling. It was a phantom tax, a system of extortion disguised as charity, its proceeds flowing directly into the church's coffers. And from there, who knew where? It was Vexen's motive, written in plain ink. He wasn't just trying to acquire the Harrow Ranch, he was squeezing the life out of the entire valley. That night, they gathered in Luke's kitchen. The evidence was laid out on the table: Abernathy's receipt for the saw, a small sample of the grayish-tan thread Eliza had managed to snip from the spool in the bank's storeroom, a carefully wrapped sample of the mud from the dry wash behind the barn, and Eliza's hand-copied notes from the church ledger. The pieces formed a single, damning picture of greed, sabotage, and murder. Wade hadn't fallen. He had been pushed. His death just another ruthless transaction in Vexen's ledger. Luke stared at the small pile of evidence, his hands clenched into fists. For all its clarity, it felt fragile, like a spider's web against a hurricane. "To challenge Vexen with this," he said, his voice a low growl of doubt, "is like lighting a match in a room full of dynamite. He owns this town, the law, the bank, the fear. He'll crush us." Eliza looked at him, her gray eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. Her own past had taught her the cost of silence, the way a small room can become a whole world if you don't fight your way out. "The fire is already in our yard." "Luke," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable, "it's been burning for a long time. We're just finally seeing the flames." A decision was made. They carefully gathered the evidence, wrapping it in a clean piece of canvas. There was no official law in Cinder Creek besides a part-time sheriff who was squarely in Vexen's pocket. But the circuit judge, an impartial arbiter named Rowe, was due in town. He was their only hope. As they prepared to leave, a sound cut through the night, the rhythmic beat of approaching horses, moving fast. Luke peered through the window. 2 riders were coming down the lane, Thorne and his companion. They had been discovered. "Out the back," Luke hissed. grabbing the canvas bundle. They slipped out into the darkness, but the riders had seen the light in the window and were already circling the house. There was nowhere to run. They crouched behind a low stone wall, their hearts pounding. Then, Eliza had an idea. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small spool of grayish-tan thread she had taken from the bank. It was a desperate, insane gamble. But it was all they had, as Thorn and the other man dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel. Eliza worked quickly. She tied one end of the thread to the fence post and, keeping low to the ground, began to unspool it, letting it trail behind her as she and Luke slipped away into the deeper shadows of the churchyard next door. The thin thread was nearly invisible in the darkness, but in the stray beams of moonlight, it caught with a faint, silvery glimmer. They hid themselves in the deepest shadow they could find, behind a large, crudely carved wooden statue of a saint whose features had been eroded by years of wind and dust. They watched as Thorn found their footprints. He held up his lantern, and its light caught the almost invisible line of the thread. They went this way. He grunted to his companion, pointing. The two men followed the trail, their eyes fixed on the glimmering thread that seemed to lead directly to their prey. But Eliza had not led them in a straight line. The thread snaked through the churchyard, a path of her own design. It led them past the silent gravestones, around the back of the church, and directly toward the front porch of the only other building on the street with a lamp still burning in its window, the boarding house where Judge Rowe was taking his rest before the next day's court session. The trap was laid, the thread of truth now a physical guide, leading Vexen's own men to deliver themselves into the hands of justice. The thread, a pale and ghostly line in the moonlight, went taut from their hiding place behind the weathered saint. Luke and Eliza saw Caleb Thorne stop dead. He looked down at the filament snagged on his boot, then followed its path back toward the fence post where it began. The hunter's instinct in him, honed by years of tracking things that didn't want to be found, finally overrode his brute momentum. He had not been tracking prey. He had been led. The ruse was broken. A harsh, guttural shout split the night. Thorne ripped the thread from the post as if it were a venomous snake. His face, illuminated by the bobbing orange glow of his lantern, was a mask of pure fury. He raised the lantern high, its light cutting a wild swath across the churchyard, and roared to his companion, "They're here in the graveyard." As if in answer, a torch flared to life in the distance. Then another. Figures began to move in the darkness near the livery stable. Vexen's net was closing, and then a sound began to toll across the plains, cold and sharp and urgent, the clang of the town's alarm bell. Not the slow, measured peal for Sunday service, but the frantic, hammering rhythm used for fires or raids. It was not a call for help, it was a call to arms. For them. There was no time for thought, only for the desperate, primal instinct of flight. "My horse," Luke snarled, grabbing the canvas bundle of evidence. He vaulted over the low stone wall, Eliza scrambling right behind him. His horse, Bess, stood tethered near the back of his small house, her eyes wide and white in the growing chaos, her ears twitching at the clang of the bell. He untied the reins with a single, savage pull. There was no time to fetch another horse, no time for anything but to escape the closing circle of torchlight. "Get up," he commanded, his hands closing around Eliza's waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He swung her onto the saddle, then vaulted up behind her in one fluid motion, his hard-muscled body a shield at her back. He dug his heels into the mare's flanks. Bess leaped forward, her powerful haunches bunching, launching them from a standstill into a full-out gallop. They shot past the edge of the churchyard, a fleeting vision of chaos, men running, shouting, their long shadows dancing in the hellish light of the torches. Luke didn't head for the open plains. That would be a fool's run. An open chase where they would be tracked and cornered. He wheeled Bess toward the one path he knew was treacherous enough to give them a chance, the Black Willow Bridge. The bridge was a nightmare even in broad daylight. Now, in the dark, it was a passage into the abyss. It was not a structure of hope. It was a skeleton of one, a long, trembling spine of weathered planks and rotting support beams that spanned the dark, greedy mouth of the creek below. The water, unseen in the gloom, was a hungry presence, its gurgle and roar a constant threat. The thunder of Bess's hooves on the first planks was a deafening drumbeat. Thump, thump, thump. Each impact was a prayer that the wood would hold. Eliza gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles white, the wind tearing at her hair. She could feel the vibration of the entire structure through the body of the horse, a deep, ominous shudder that traveled up her own spine. Luke's arm was a band of iron around her waist, holding her secure, his breath hot on her neck. The first gunshot cracked behind them. The sound was sharp, brittle, instantly swallowed by the roar of the creek. A high-pitched whine zipped past Eliza's ear, so close she felt its passage as a brief, cold whisper. Then another shot. A chunk of wood the size of a man's fist exploded from the railing beside them, the splinters spraying like shrapnel. Bess never faltered. She was a creature of courage and trust, her stride sure and desperate on the treacherous footing. Planks rattled and groaned under her weight. Below them, the black water churned, its surface briefly illuminated by the pursuing torches, revealing a chaotic, swirling current that would swallow a man whole and spit out only his memory. They were halfway across. The far bank, a dark wall of safety, was just yards away. But Thorne and his men were at the bridge's entrance now, their dark forms silhouetted against the torchlight. They wouldn't risk their own horses on the rotten structure, but their guns had no such reservations. Another bullet chewed into the planking right in front of Bess's pounding hooves. The mare shied, a terrified whinny torn from her throat. For a sickening moment, her hoof slipped, and the world tilted. Luke's grip tightened, his body moving with the horse, his voice a low, calming rumble in her ear that was felt more than heard. He brought her back under control, his horsemanship a form of raw, desperate grace. As they reached the solid ground of the far bank, Luke didn't stop. He slid from the saddle while the horse was still moving, landing on his feet with the agility of a cat. "Keep going," he yelled to Eliza, slapping Bess's rump. The horse, sensing freedom, bolted into the darkness of the trees beyond. Luke turned back to the bridge. He had a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, a tool as essential to him as his own hands. In seconds, he had looped one end around the thickest of the bridge's main support posts on his side of the creek. He braced his feet, his muscles coiling. He was not just pulling. He was putting every ounce of his grief, his rage, his desperate will to survive into a single, violent motion. He heaved. The rope went taut, groaning under the strain. The old support post, its base already weakened by 100 floods and 1,000 days of rot, creaked in protest. It tilted, its ancient moorings in the creek bank tearing loose, with an agonized shriek of tortured timber and the sharp crack of snapping planks. A whole section of the bridge gave way. The walkway sagged, then collapsed, plunging into the churning water below, leaving a 10-foot chasm of black, roaring space. The pursuit was cut off, but not entirely. Before the last of the debris had even hit the water, a figure took a running leap from the other side. It was Thorne. He flew through the air, his body a dark, hurtling projectile, landing with a jarring thud on the remaining section of the bridge. He stumbled, his arms windmilling for balance on the buckled planks, but he stayed upright. He was on their side, alone. The canvas sack of evidence, which had fallen from Luke's shoulder when he jumped, lay on the ground just a few feet from the bridge's edge. Thorne saw it, and a predatory grin split his face. He lunged for the bag. Luke met him head-on. There were no words, only the brutal, grunting language of hand-to-hand combat. Luke's fist connected with Thorne's jaw, a solid crack of bone on bone. Thorne staggered back, but recovered, driving the heel of his hand into Luke's bandaged shoulder. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded behind Luke's eyes. He gasped, his left arm going numb. Eliza had slid from the horse as soon as she was in the cover of the trees. She turned back, her heart in her throat, just in time to see Thorn's cheap shot. She wasn't helpless. She was a woman who had fought her way out of a locked room. Her canvas carryall lay on the ground where it had fallen. She ripped it open, her hand closing around a solid, familiar shape, the heavy wooden frame of her portable sewing shuttle. A tool of creation she would now use for preservation. She ran forward, her skirts flying. Thorn had pressed his advantage, landing a heavy blow to Luke's ribs. As Luke staggered, Eliza swung the wooden frame with all her might, connecting with the side of Thorn's head with a solid, sickening thud. The man grunted, his eyes glazing over for a second. He stumbled sideways, dazed, shaking his head like a stunned bull. The brief respite was all Luke needed. He drove forward, tackling Thorn around the waist, trying to wrestle him to the ground, but his footing was uncertain on the loose gravel at the edge of the creek bank. As Thorn thrashed, Luke's boot slipped. He went down, his fingers scrabbling for a handhold, his hand closing on the splintery, rotten wood of the bridge's remaining railing. He was hanging half over the edge, the black water roaring just a few feet below him, his grip the only thing keeping him from oblivion. Thorn, his head clearing, loomed over him, a cruel smile returning to his face. He raised his heavy boot to stomp on Luke's fingers. "Luke." Eliza's voice cut through the roar of the water, sharp and clear and commanding. "Look at me. He did." He tore his eyes away from the churning abyss below, away from the boot descending toward his hand, and he looked at her. In her eyes, he did not see fear. He saw a fierce, unyielding strength. He saw the fire from their shared hearth. He saw a reason. It was an anchor, stronger than any rope, more solid than any ground. Adrenaline, sharp and potent, surged through him. As Thorn's boot came down, Luke released his grip on the railing, swinging his body under the blow. He grabbed Thorn's ankle with his good hand, and with a final, desperate roar of effort, he pulled. Thorn was caught completely off balance. He shrieked, a high, thin sound of surprise, as his legs were swept out from under him. He toppled backward, his arms flailing, and plunged into the black, churning water of the creek. He surfaced once, his mouth open in a silent scream, before the powerful current grabbed him and pulled him under, vanishing into the roaring darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of the water and their own ragged breathing. Luke hauled himself back onto solid ground, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and pain. Eliza rushed to his side, her hands hovering, not sure where to touch. He looked at her, his eyes full of a dawning wonder. He grabbed the canvas sack of evidence, their small, hard-won victory. In the trees, Bess let out a low whinny, a call of reassurance, across the chasm. The torches of Vexen's men bobbed and weaved in angry confusion, their shouts faint against the roar of the water. Small embers from their torches broke free, drifting on the wind, dying like falling stars against the black sky. And then a new sound began, the church bell. It had stopped its frantic alarm, but now it began to ring again, this time with a slow, steady, questioning peal. The sound of gunfire and shouting had finally broken the spell of fear that Vexen held over the town. All across Cinder Creek, doors creaked open, lanterns bloomed in the darkness, small, hesitant flowers of light. People emerged from their homes, their faces pale with sleep and confusion. Drawn by the sounds of violence, they began to drift, a silent, uncertain crowd, toward the churchyard, and there, glinting in the collective glow of their dozens of lanterns, was the path Eliza had laid, the single, delicate, grayish-tan thread. It was no longer a trick. It was a guide. It was a question mark, leading them from the familiar safety of their homes, past the church and straight toward the scene of the crime, the broken bridge, the angry, thwarted men, and the two figures standing on the far side, holding the truth in a canvas bag. The lonely had become the many. The tide was turning. The church was not built for judgment, but tonight it had become a courtroom. The air, usually thick with the scent of old hymnals and beeswax, was sharp with the metallic tang of human anxiety. Oil lamps, brought from every house in Cinder Creek, were perched on windowsills and hung from the rafters, their collective glow pushing back the darkness but creating a web of dancing, uncertain shadows on the high, beamed ceiling. The townsfolk packed the pews, their faces pale and serious in the flickering light. They were not here for a sermon. They were here for a reckoning. At the front, before the simple wooden altar, a trestle table had been set up. On one side sat Silas Vexen, his posture as rigid and impeccable as his starched collar. He looked bored, as if this entire proceeding were a tedious but necessary formality. On the other side stood Luke and Eliza, their faces etched with a weary resolve. Presiding over it all was Judge Rowe, a man whose face seemed carved from the same hard, unforgiving landscape as the canyons that surrounded them. His eyes, deep-set and shrewd, missed nothing. "This is an informal hearing." The judge's voice was a low, gravelly sound that commanded silence. "But the testimony given will be considered binding, Mr. Vexen. You have brought a complaint of trespass and a notice of foreclosure. State your case." Vexen rose slowly, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He did not look at Luke or Eliza, or at the crowded pews. He addressed the judge as if they were the only two men in the room. "The case is simple, Your Honor," he said, his voice as flat and cold as a sheet of iron. He placed a signed loan agreement on the table. "The Harrow family has an outstanding debt with my bank, secured by the deed to their property. The payment is past due. I have served them notice. The law is the law." He sat down, folding his hands on the table. He had built his argument like a fortress, with walls of legal fact. He did not believe it could be breached. Debt is debt. Judge Rowe looked at the contract. Then his gaze shifted to Luke. "Mr. Harrow, your response." Luke did not speak. He moved to the table, the canvas sack in his hand. He untied the knot and upended the bag. The contents spilled onto the wooden surface, not with a soft rustle, but with a series of hard, declarative sounds that echoed in the church's profound silence. The first sound was a metallic scrape, a fine-toothed utility saw, its blade still faintly smeared with wood dust. The second was the soft clatter of paper, the receipt from Abernathy's store, signed by Caleb Thorne. The third was a heavy, dull thud, a small, cloth-wrapped bundle of ashen-gray mud, taken from the wash behind his barn. The final sound was a barely audible click, as a small spool of grayish-tan thread rolled to a stop. Each item landed like a hammer blow, not against the table, but against the very foundation of Vexen's ironclad case. A low murmur rippled through the pews, the sound of 100 private thoughts suddenly converging into a single, public question. "This is my response," Luke said, his voice raw. He looked directly at Vexen, and for the first time, a flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed the banker's placid features. Judge Rowe leaned forward, examining the strange collection of objects. "Miss Hart," he said, turning to Eliza, "perhaps you can explain the meaning of this exhibit." Eliza stepped forward. She was not a lawyer, she was not a public speaker, but she was a woman who understood how things were put together and how they could be deliberately, maliciously, pulled apart. In her hand, she held a piece of paper on which she had drawn a simple, clear diagram. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness, "this thread matches the thread used to clumsily mend a coat belonging to a man in Mr. Vexen's employ, the same man who, according to Mr. Abernathy's ledger, purchased this saw." She pointed to the spool, then the saw. "I myself have seen a larger spool of this same unusual, oil-scented thread in the back room of Mr. Vexen's bank." She then unrolled her diagram. It showed a map of the Harrow property, the barn, and the dry wash behind it, and it showed a second map, a rough sketch of the Black Canyon ledge where Wade Harrow had died. "This mud," she said, her voice gaining strength, "was found where Mr. Harrow was attacked the night his barn was broken into. He tells me the same mud was present on the ledge from which his brother fell last year. It is a unique color, Your Honor, an ashen gray, the same color as the dirt used in the sandbags behind Mr. Vexen's bank." She laid the drawing on the table. The lines were simple, but their implication was a web of conspiracy that was suddenly horrifyingly clear. The thread, the saw, the mud. They were the stitches that sewed together a story of sabotage, intimidation, and quite possibly murder. A story designed to make the Harrow curse a reality, to drive a family from their land so that Vexen could possess it. Vexen stood up, a tight, angry smile on his lips. "This is absurd. A woman's fantasy. A collection of circumstantial trinkets and mud pies. I have a legally binding contract. They have dirt." Judge Rowe held up a hand, silencing him. He stared at the evidence on the table for a long, silent minute. He looked at the hard, desperate hope in Luke's eyes, the quiet, unshakable certainty in Eliza's, and the first faint cracks in Vexen's composure. "I agree that this evidence is circumstantial," the judge said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. "But it is also deeply troubling. It requires verification." He fixed his gaze on Vexen. "Therefore, I am issuing a stay. The foreclosure is suspended for 3 days. During this time, my clerk will verify the signature on this receipt and obtain a sample of the soil from behind the bank. Mr. Vexen, you and your employees are forbidden from setting foot on or near Harrow property until this matter is resolved." A collective sigh of relief, soft as a passing breeze, swept through the pews. It was not a victory, but it was a breath. It was a chance. Later, as a fine, misty rain began to fall. Luke and Eliza stood on the boarding house porch. The street was empty, the townsfolk having dispersed to their homes, their minds buzzing with the night's events. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the suffocating pressure had eased. Luke looked at Eliza, her profile illuminated by the soft light spilling from the window. He saw the strength that had stood up to an entire town's fear, the intelligence that had pieced together a puzzle of lies. He was overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude so profound it felt like a physical force. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, and leaned in, intending to close the small distance between them. She didn't pull away, but she turned her head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Her eyes, soft and serious in the misty light, met his. She placed her hand over his, her touch warm against his skin. "When we're still running." "Luke," she said, her voice a near whisper, "let's just keep our breath." It wasn't a rejection, it was a promise that when the race was truly over, they could finally stop and breathe together. He understood. He nodded, letting his hand fall away. The moment of shared understanding more intimate than any kiss. Eliza knew that Vexen's power was rooted in the town's isolation and fear. The next morning, she set about dismantling it, stitch by stitch. She put a sign outside her granary, "Free mending all day." One by one, then in small groups, the women of the town came. They brought torn shirts and ripped trousers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and caution. As Eliza worked, her treadle machine humming a steady, rhythmic tune, she spoke. She didn't talk of murder or conspiracy. She talked of community. "I can't pay for protection," she said to Mrs. Abernathy as she mended her son's overalls. "But I can offer my skill. All I ask is that you and your husbands take turns keeping a watch on the Harrow place, just for a few nights, just so he knows we're not alone." It was a simple, powerful exchange, not of money, but of mutual support, a mended seam for a watchful eye. By late afternoon, a roster had been drawn up. The blacksmith would take the first watch, the livery owner the second. The farmers from the outlying properties would ride a perimeter. Eliza had taken her needle and thread and stitched the frayed edges of the community back together. That night, a strange and beautiful thing happened. As darkness fell, lanterns began to appear, dotted all around the perimeter of the Harrow ranch. Men sat on wagons and porch steps, their rifles across their laps, their pipes glowing like fireflies in the dark. It was a silent, luminous vigil. The town had formed a circle of light around the ranch, a constellation of small, brave stars brought down to earth to hold back the night. Vexen saw the lights from his office window. The sight of this quiet, organized defiance sent a spike of cold fury through him. He had underestimated the seamstress. He had underestimated the town's capacity for courage. He sent one of his men, a hulking figure with a belligerent swagger, to break the circle. The man strode toward the line of lanterns, his voice a drunken, bullying roar. "What's this, a prayer meetin'? Get on home to your wives before you get hurt." No one moved. The men just sat there, silent, their faces grim in the lantern light. The bully grew bolder. He took a step toward the blacksmith, raising his hand. And then, the church bell began to ring. It wasn't the frantic alarm of the night before. It was a single, clear, resonant tone. Then another, and another. Someone was in the bell tower, sending out a signal. At the sound, the seated men stood up. As one, they began to walk forward, out of their circle of light, forming a solid, silent line. They were not running. They were not shouting. They were a wall, a human wall, advancing slowly, inexorably, their shared purpose a tangible force in the night air. The bully stopped. His bravado evaporated in the face of this silent, unified front. He looked from face to determined face, and for the first time, he saw not a collection of frightened debtors, but a community. He took a step back, then another, then he turned and fled into the darkness from which he had come. The wall of men stopped, watched him go, and then quietly returned to their vigil, their circle of light unbroken. The 3-day stay was a suspension of time. Cinder Creek held its breath. The entire town caught in the quiet, tense moment between a lightning flash and the inevitable roar of thunder. The circle of lanterns around the Harrow Ranch held for 2 nights, a silent, defiant constellation against Vexen's encroaching darkness. On the 3rd day, the town gathered not in the church, but in the open square before it, under the vast, impartial gaze of the sky. The sun was climbing toward its zenith, a relentless, truth-seeking eye that bleached the color from the landscape and burned away the morning shadows. Judge Rowe's trestle table was set up on the church steps, turning the humble porch into a dais of judgment. The mood was different from the hearing in the church. The shadows of fear had been replaced by the bright, hard glare of anticipation. The first witness called was Mr. Abernathy. The storekeeper approached the table, his ledger held to his chest like a shield. He was a man who lived by the clear, unambiguous lines of his accounts, and he seemed determined to let them speak for him. "Mr. Abernathy," the judge began, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You were asked to verify an entry in your sales ledger." Abernathy opened the book, his bony finger tracing a line on the page. "Your Honor, the entry is correct. I sold 1 fine-tooth utility saw to Caleb Thorne." "And the signature," the judge pressed. "You are familiar with Mr. Thorne's mark. He has purchased goods on credit before," Abernathy said, a hint of disapproval in his tone. "The signature on the receipt is a match to the one in my credit ledger. It is his." The words were simple, factual, and as solid as the iron weights on his store's scales. Next, the judge's clerk, a young man with a perpetually worried expression, presented a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal 2 samples of dried mud, side by side. One was dark and crumbly, taken from the base of the retaining wall behind the bank. The other was a pale, ashen gray, taken from the Harrow property. They were as different as night and day. The clerk then produced a folded canvas sandbag, which he had been authorized to retrieve. He slid it open with a knife, and a stream of pale, ashen gray dirt poured onto a clean board. It was a perfect match to the sample from Luke's land. The mud that had tripped Wade, the mud that had smeared Luke's hand, did not come from the creek. It came from Vexen's private supply. The crowd murmured, the sound a low, angry hum, like a nest of disturbed hornets. Vexen, seated beside his lawyer, remained impassive. but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "The final piece of this puzzle," the judge announced, "concerns a man named Peterson's work coat and a spool of thread." He called forward a small, nervous man named Elias Gable, who worked as a tailor and clerk for Vexen, handling his personal accounts and mending. Gable approached the table, his eyes darting fearfully from the judge to Vexen and back again. He twisted a worn felt hat in his hands. "Mr. Gable," the judge said, his voice softening slightly, "you were shown a sample of grayish-tan thread. Do you recognize it?" Gable swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He nodded, unable to speak. "Please answer for the record." "Yes, sir," Gable whispered. "It's from a large spool, mister. Vexen keeps. He calls it his utility thread. Strong, he says. Good for mending canvas and leather." "And do you recognize the scent of machine oil on that thread?" Gable nodded again. He oils it himself. Says it preserves the fiber, makes it slide through thick material easier." Eliza watched, her hands clasped. The oiled thread was not an accident. It was a signature, a small, arrogant detail that Vexen believed no one would ever notice. "One last question. Mr. Gable," the judge said, his voice hardening again. "A few weeks ago, did you mend a canvas coat for a man named Peterson, who sometimes works for Mr. Vexen?" Gable's face went pale. He looked at Vexen, whose eyes were now fixed on him, cold and sharp as shards of glass. The tailor trembled, his fear a palpable thing. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, at his neighbors, at the blacksmith and the livery owner and Mr. Abernathy. He saw not a mob, but a community, waiting. Their collective gaze seemed to give him a strength he did not possess on his own. He took a deep breath. I did not mend a coat for Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "Mr. Vexen instructed me to sew a disguise. He gave me one of his old work coats and told me to alter it to fit Caleb Thorne. He said Thorne needed to move about unnoticed for a job." The admission hung in the sun-drenched air, stark and damning. The clumsy repair on the coat had not been a repair at all. It had been part of a costume. The judge turned his piercing gaze to Vexen. "I have also reviewed your personal ledgers, Mr. Vexen, which you were ordered to produce. I find a recurring series of entries listed as civic contributions to the church, funded by so-called road and bridge maintenance fees, collected from your debtors. Can you explain why these fees, which are not legally sanctioned, were collected, and why the funds seem to have been used to purchase land and assets under a holding company registered in your name?" The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The extortion, the sabotage, the murder, it was all part of a single, monstrous engine of greed, designed to consolidate Vexen's power and drain the valley of its wealth. Vexen rose, his composure finally cracking. The mask of calm indifference fell away, revealing a face tight with a cold, intellectual rage. "You fools!" he spat, his voice no longer smooth but sharp and brittle. "You speak of my methods, but you ignore my results. This town was nothing before I arrived, a collection of mud huts and failed enterprises. I brought order, I protected the value of this land. I made it worth something, I was protecting that order." A voice from the crowd, raw and angry, shouted back, "You weren't protecting order. Vexen, you were selling it." The cry was picked up by another, then another, until it became a single, unified chant, a wave of sound that crashed against the church steps. "You were selling order, selling order." It was the voice of a people who had finally recognized the true name of their oppressor. Luke stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent. He was not looking at Vexen. He was looking at his neighbors, at the people who had for so long whispered about his family's curse. "My brother, Wade," he said, his voice clear and steady, devoid of the ragged edge of grief it had carried for so long. "He didn't die because of bad luck. He didn't die because of a shadow on our name. He died because of mud that a man put on a ledge to make him fall. He spoke the truth into the bright, open air, and in doing so, He reclaimed his brother's life from the realm of superstitious gossip and placed it firmly in the world of human consequence. Wade Harrow was not a victim of fate. He was the victim of a crime. At that exact moment, the church bell began to ring. It was not a summons or an alarm. It was the slow, measured, resonant tolling of the noon hour. The sun hung directly overhead, at the highest point of its journey. The shadows on the ground shrank, pulling back until they were nothing but dark, dense outlines at the feet of the people who cast them. There was nowhere left to hide. In the stark, vertical light, the faces of Vexen's handful of henchmen, scattered throughout the crowd, seemed exposed, their furtive glances and nervous postures suddenly obvious, one by one, as if shamed by the light itself. They lowered their heads and untied the bandanas they wore around their necks, letting them fall. Their allegiance, once a source of meager power, was now a mark of public disgrace. Judge Rowe stood, his verdict as clear and uncompromising as the midday sun. "Silas Vexen," he declared, his voice ringing across the square, "I find you guilty of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to cause criminal damage. The matter of Wade Harrow's death will be referred to the Territorial Marshal for a full murder investigation." A gasp went through the crowd. "All fees and penalties collected under the guise of road maintenance are hereby declared null and void, and the funds shall be returned to their rightful owners. A fine so heavy it will strip you of every asset you have wrongfully acquired in this valley is imposed upon you." He looked at Luke. "As for the Harrow debt, the foreclosure is permanently canceled. The loan is to be restructured. Payments will be due not by the arbitrary date on a calendar, but according to the season of the grass. When the land provides, the debt will be paid. That is the only law that makes sense here." It was a judgment rooted not just in law books, but in the wisdom of the land itself. A quiet, profound sense of rightness settled over the square. Eliza reached out and took Luke's hand. Her fingers laced through his, a small, firm anchor in the swirling sea of emotion. The roar that went up from the crowd was not one of vengeance, but of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the sound of a long-held breath being released. As the sound washed over them, it softened, the angry roar diminishing into a gentle, sustained cheer, and then into a kind of happy, peaceful silence. A few of the town's children, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, ran forward. They carried a new sign, clumsily painted on a piece of spare planking. They ran to the old granary, Eliza's small kingdom of repair, and hung the sign over the door. It didn't say seamstress or mending. It read, in bright, hopeful letters, "Sowing Mercy." The two words hung together in the bright noon light. One was a craft, a skill of the hands. The other was a quality of the heart, here in Cinder Creek. Thanks to a woman with a needle and a community that had found its courage, they had become one and the same. The storm had passed. Not just the one of wind and dust, but the deeper, more violent storm of secrets and fear that had held Cinder Creek in its grip for so long. Vexen was gone, his assets seized, his reign of quiet terror dismantled. The town, in the aftermath, was like a field after a long drought has been broken by a soaking rain. The air was clean. The people walked with a lighter step, their faces turned toward the sun. A fragile, tentative peace settled over the valley. In this newfound quiet, the world beyond Cinder Creek began to make itself known again. The stagecoach, which had for a time avoided the town due to its reputation for trouble, resumed its regular schedule. And one afternoon, it brought a letter for Eliza. It was from Silver Junction, a prosperous mining town 2 days' ride to the north. She had passed through it once, a bustling place of brick buildings, wide boardwalks, and the constant, hopeful ring of hammers. The letter was from the owner of the town's largest mercantile, a man who had seen a sample of her work on a traveler's mended cloak. The offer it contained was a dream she had not dared to entertain for years. He was opening a new wing for fine tailoring and dressmaking. He wanted her to run it. She would have her own workroom with a large, north-facing plate glass window, perfect for fine stitchery. She would have a guaranteed salary, one that was more than double what she could ever hope to earn in a place like Cinder Creek. She would have security, respect, and a name of her own in a town that was growing, not just surviving. She read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. She sat in her corner of the granary, the familiar smells of hay and dust surrounding her, and she could almost feel the cool, smooth glass of that window under her palm. She could see the bolts of silk and merino wool, could hear the cheerful chatter of customers who were not bringing her their broken things, but their hopes for new ones. It was a path forward, a clean, well-lit path away from the dust, the whispers, and the painful memories that Cinder Creek, for all its recent kindness, still held. It was the future she had thought was stolen from her. That evening, she found Luke by the corral, leaning against the top rail, watching his horses. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold, and the light was gentle on the land. The herd, which had been skittish and thin, was beginning to look healthy again. Their coats shone, and they moved with a placid, easy grace. The land was healing, and so were its creatures. She stood beside him, the letter a folded square in her apron pocket, its sharp corners pressing against her. The silence between them was comfortable, a space that no longer needed to be filled with words. But tonight, it felt heavy with the words that remained unspoken. "I received a letter," she said finally, her voice soft. "An offer, from Silver Junction." He did not turn to look at her, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. He kept his gaze on the horses. "It's a good town," he said, his voice a low rumble, growing fast. "A woman with your skill would do well there." There was no surprise in his voice, no jealousy, only a flat, quiet acknowledgement of the truth. "They've offered me a position," she continued, her own voice steady. "A shop of my own, with a glass window." She didn't know why she added that last detail, except that it felt like the most important part. It was a symbol of a life she couldn't have here. Luke was silent for a long time. The last of the sun's light faded from the sky, and the first stars began to prick the deep, velvety darkness. He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "Stay," he said. The word was not a plea. It was a proposal. "Don't work in the granary. There's an old storeroom next to the barn. It's solid. We could fix it up. Put in a new window, a big one, facing east for the morning light." He paused, taking a breath. "There's work to be done here. My saddles, my bridles, they're always in need of mending. The ranchers in this valley, they need tough clothes, canvas coats, leather goods. There's a living to be made, for both of us." He looked toward the dark outline of the barn. "We could build a proper workshop, for sewing and leatherwork. We could hang a sign." He met her eyes, and his were dark with a serious, quiet intensity. "We could share the name on the sign, Harrow and Hart." The generosity of the offer, the simple, profound equality of it, caught her breath. He wasn't asking her to be his wife, or his housekeeper, or his dependent. He was asking her to be his partner. He was offering her a future that was not just alongside his, but intertwined with it, a business built with both their hands, under a name that honored them both. But as the warmth of his offer spread through her, a familiar, cold tendril of fear curled in its wake. Her past was not just a memory of a locked room. It was a memory of a world where her name, her work, her very existence had been consumed by a man's. She had fought so hard for her independence, for the simple freedom of being Eliza Hart, a seamstress who moved through the world on her own terms. She looked at the Harrow Ranch, at the sturdy house and the sprawling land, and she saw a life, a world, that was entirely his. She was terrified that if she stayed, she would become just another part of it, an addition, a shadow in the house of a man she was beginning to love. She couldn't voice the fear. It was too deep, too tangled in a shame she still carried. But Luke, who had learned to read the quiet language of her silences, saw the conflict in her eyes. He saw the flicker of hope and the shadow of fear that immediately followed it. He said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, ornate iron key. It was the key to the main barn, the largest and most important building on his property. He held it out to her, placing it in her open palm. The metal was cool and solid against her skin. "A partner," he said, his voice low and firm, answering the question she hadn't dared to ask. Not a shadow. The key was more than a piece of metal. It was a deed. It was trust. It was proof that he understood her fear of being contained, and that he was offering her not a cage, however gilded, but a space of her own, a domain to command within his world. The next morning, they started on the storeroom. It was a forgotten space, filled with the detritus of a generation, broken tools, dried-out harnesses, stacks of old newspapers yellowed with age. For 2 days, they worked, clearing it out. They swept away the thick blankets of dust and the intricate, abandoned cities of spiders. Luke, with a strength that was careful and precise, knocked out a section of the east-facing wall, framing a space for a new, large window. Eliza, with her eye for order, planned the layout, marking the floor with chalk where her cutting table would go, where his workbench would stand. They didn't talk much as they worked. They moved in a comfortable, complementary rhythm. He would lift something heavy, she would direct him where to put it. She would sweep, he would haul the debris away. In the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom, dust motes danced and swirled, tiny, luminous particles of the past making way for a new future. They brought her sewing machine over from the granary, its heavy iron body a stark, black anchor in the newly cleared space. They set it down beside the long, scarred wooden bench where Luke's father, and his father before him, had tooled leather and mended harnesses. The two objects, one for thread, one for leather, sat side by side, symbols of two different lives, two different skills, now destined to share the same roof. As they worked, Eliza watched Luke. He moved with a new lightness, a burden lifted from his shoulders. The deep, weary lines around his eyes had softened. He even laughed, a low, rusty sound, when a mouse darted out from behind an old crate, sending Eliza scrambling onto a stool. And she noticed his hands. The angry red scars from old rope burns and new fights were beginning to fade, the skin healing, becoming less a map of his pain and more the quiet testament to his labor. The work was healing him. On the third evening, the storeroom was clean. The frame for the new window was set, and the space was filled with the clean, hopeful smell of raw, sawn wood. They stood in the doorway, tired and streaked with dirt, and looked at what they had made. It was not just a clean room, it was a beginning. That night, by the light of her lamp, Eliza took out a fresh sheet of paper and her pen. She wrote to the mercantile owner in Silver Junction. Her hand was steady as she formed the words, thanking him for his generous offer. When she wrote the line, "I must respectfully decline, as I have decided to enter into a new business partnership here in Cinder Creek," her pen point trembled for just a second. A brief acknowledgement of the safe, easy future she was letting go. But then it moved on, sure and certain as she signed her name. The next day, she and Luke painted the sign. They used a long, smooth plank of pine and a pot of glossy black paint. He drew the letters, his hand surprisingly steady, and she filled them in, her brushstrokes even and precise. Harrow heart, leather thread. When it was done, they hung it over the door of the new workshop. They stood back, side by side, and looked up at it. The sun was warm on their faces. A bead of sweat trickled down Luke's temple, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, leaving a faint smudge of black paint. Eliza saw it and smiled. He looked at her, at the matching smudge of paint on her own cheek, and his smile mirrored hers. It was a quiet, shared moment of accomplishment, earned with their own hands. A breeze whispered across the plains, carrying the sweet, clean scent of new grass growing in the pastures. From inside the open door of the workshop, the distinct smells of their two worlds mingled in the warm air, the sharp, rich tang of leather oil and the simple, clean scent of fresh cotton fabric. They were two separate notes, but together, they were forming a new and harmonious chord. The sun was low, painting the dust in the air a soft, hazy gold. The heat of the day had broken, leaving behind a comfortable warmth that settled over the valley like a well-worn blanket. The church bell began to ring, not with the urgency of an alarm or the solemnity of a verdict, but with the gentle, rhythmic peal that marked the end of the workday. It was a sound of peace, of tools being set down and families gathering. Inside the new workshop, the mingled scents of leather and linen had become the room's permanent perfume. Luke was at his bench, carefully beveling the edge of a long strip of harness leather, his movements economical and sure. Eliza sat at her sewing machine, the treadle moving in a steady, whispering rhythm as she finished the hem on a new calico dress for Mrs. Abernathy. The large, east-facing window Luke had built now held a pane of real glass, a luxury purchased with the first profits from their joint venture. It filled the room with a clear, honest light. A small cluster of children appeared in the open doorway, their bare feet dusty, their faces serious with the gravity of their mission. It was the blacksmith's youngest boy and the two Miller sisters. The boy, clutching a leather satchel, stepped forward as the designated spokesman. "Ma'am, sir," he began, his voice a little shaky. "The button came off my school bag. Pa tried to fix it, but he just made the hole bigger." Eliza stopped her work, her smile warm and immediate. "Of course, bring it here." The boy laid the satchel on her cutting table. The leather was thick and stiff, and a ragged hole showed where the metal button had torn free. It was a job that required more than a simple needle and thread. She examined the damage, her expert fingers assessing the tear. "This will need a new leather patch to hold the button securely," she said, more to herself than to the children. She looked over at Luke. "I'll need a small, round piece, and 2 thin strips for the backing." Luke didn't need to be asked twice. He set down his harness strap, walked over to his bin of scrap leather, and selected a piece of the right thickness and color. He took a small, sharp cutting tool, and with a few swift movements, carved a perfect circle from the hide. The children watched, their eyes wide with fascination, as he then sliced 2 thin, strong laces from the edge of the scrap. He handed the pieces to Eliza. Their hands brushed as she took them. It was a simple, accidental contact, the kind that happened a dozen times a day as they passed tools and materials back and forth. But in that small, unremarkable gesture, there was a world of partnership. He knew the needs of her craft. She trusted the skill of his hands. Eliza took an awl and punched a series of small, neat holes in the leather patch and through the satchel flap. She showed the oldest Miller girl how to thread one of the thin leather laces through the holes, her hands guiding the child's. Luke, meanwhile, showed the boy how to polish the new metal button with a soft cloth until it gleamed. It was an impromptu lesson, a quiet moment of instruction that wove the children into the fabric of the workshop's life. In a few minutes, the repair was done, stronger and neater than it had been before. The children, clutching the mended satchel, offered their thanks and scampered back out into the golden evening, their laughter trailing behind them. Luke and Eliza stood in the quiet aftermath, a shared, unspoken satisfaction settling between them. Eliza turned to her sewing basket. From beneath a layer of folded fabric, she took out a small, neatly pressed square of white linen. It was the handkerchief she had clutched in her hand during the sandstorm, the one that had absorbed the sweat of her terror. But it was different now. In the center, stitched in a simple, steady line with thread the color of a stormy blue sky, were 2 words, "Hold steady." She held it out to him. "I wanted you to have this," she said, her voice soft. He took it from her, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle on the soft fabric. He read the words, his thumb tracing the shape of the letters. He understood. She was taking a symbol of her deepest fear, a relic of her past trauma, and transforming it. It was no longer an object of weakness, but a testament to the strength they had found together. It was a gift of shared memory, a promise that he was the anchor that had held her steady, and that she, in turn, was his. He didn't say thank you. The words felt too small for the magnitude of the gesture. Instead, he took the handkerchief, folded it into a narrow band, and wrapped it around his left wrist. He tied a simple, secure knot, the white linen stark against his sun-browned skin, covering the pale, faded lines of the old scars beneath. It was like tying off a bandage for the last time, not to stanch a wound, but to mark the place where one had finally, truly healed. He was binding himself to a new rhythm, a new life. They walked outside and stood under their new sign, the black letters of Harrow Heart, dark against the deepening twilight sky. The last of the sun's warmth lingered on the wooden planks of the workshop wall. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but so close she could feel the steady warmth radiating from him. They breathed in the cool evening air, a slow, shared rhythm that needed no counting. They were not running anymore. Eliza looked up at the sign, at the two names joined together by a simple ampersand. She thought of her fear of becoming a shadow, of being consumed by his world, but standing here, with the key to the barn in her pocket and her name painted on the sign, she felt not diminished, but expanded. She turned her head, her voice a near whisper, meant only for him. "You don't just touch me, Luke," she said, the words a quiet revelation. "You hold the part of my life I was afraid to touch." He looked down at her, his eyes dark and full of a profound, gentle understanding. He had been so afraid of his own touch, believing it to be a curse that brought only loss. But with her, it had been a source of healing. She had taken his touch and shown him it was not an instrument of ruin, but of rescue. "The past is still there, Eliza," he answered, his voice a low, soft rumble. "But it walks behind us now. It doesn't lead." He lowered his head then, and she lifted hers. The kiss, when it came, was as soft and gentle as a speck of dust settling in a sunbeam. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate relief. It was a quiet, certain confirmation of a truth that had been building between them, stitch by stitch, day by day. It was a promise, made without an audience, needing no witness but the rising stars. It was not an ending. It was a foundation. In the distance, the lights of Cinder Creek began to flicker on, one by one. From the saloon came not the sound of angry shouts or malicious gossip, but the warm, muffled sound of men laughing, the cheerful clinking of glasses. The town was healing, too. Tomorrow, they would wake with the sun. He would cut and shape the leather, and she would stitch and sew the thread. He would drive the nails that held things together, and she would make the seams that mended what was torn. And each day's work, each small act of creation and repair, would be another steady step out of the shadows and into the light. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.